The first thing that drew me to the property was the lake. Crystal clear and framed by tall pines, it stretched like a jewel across the landscape, untouched and serene. It was my escape, a place where I could fish, swim, or simply sit on the dock and let the world fade away. The property had come with its quirks, of course. There were a few easements granting my neighbors access to the shoreline, but those didn't bother me. Most of the folks around here were respectful and friendly, most of them. Enter the HOA. I hadn't thought much about the homeowners association when I moved in. My property wasn't part of their domain. It sat just outside their boundaries, and my lake, too, was free from their jurisdiction. Or so I thought. It started innocently enough with a letter from the HOA president, Doug Simmons. It was polite, if a little presumptuous, thanking me for allowing the neighborhood to enjoy the lake and suggesting I adhere to their guidelines for lakefront maintenance. I didn't respond. My lake, my rules. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't so polite. Doug accused me of neglecting the lake by not following the HOA's guidelines, which included restrictions on fishing, swimming, and even the type of plants allowed near the water. I ignored that one too. Then came the fines. $500 for unauthorized landscaping. $750 for unapproved water activities. The absurdity of it made me laugh at first. But the fines kept coming along with threats of legal action. Doug and his HOA minions were relentless, and their tone became increasingly aggressive. The lake is a vital community resource, one letter declared, and as such it must comply with HOA standards. I was furious. The lake wasn't a community resource. It was private property, my private property. I called my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no claim to the lake or my land. Still, the constant harassment was grating, and Doug's letters were starting to feel like more than just idle threats. The final straw came on a sunny Saturday afternoon. I was out on the lake in my kayak, enjoying the peace and quiet, when I spotted two men in polo shirts and khakis standing on the dock. They carried clipboards and were peering into the water as if conducting an inspection. "Can I help you?" I called, paddling closer. "We're with the HOA," one of them said, not bothering to introduce himself. "We're here to assess the lake's compliance with community standards." I laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "This is private property. You have no authority here." The other man, clearly the more self-important of the two, adjusted his glasses and said, "The HOA has determined that the lake is part of the neighborhood's shared resources. We have every right to ensure it's properly maintained." "Do you now?" I said, pulling out my phone. "I think the local police might disagree." The man scoffed. "Call whoever you want. We're not leaving until this inspection is complete." So I did just that. As I dialed, the two men exchanged uneasy glances but stayed put. By the time the officers arrived, I was standing on the dock, arms crossed, with the HOA inspectors looking distinctly less confident. "This is private property," I told the officers. "These men are trespassing." The taller officer nodded. "Do you have documentation of ownership?" "Right here," I said, handing him a copy of my deed. The officers reviewed the papers and then turned to the HOA representatives. "Gentlemen," the taller officer said, "you're trespassing. Leave now or we'll have to escalate this matter." But the HOA has jurisdiction," the bespectacled man stammered. The officer raised an eyebrow. "Not according to this deed. This lake is private property, and you have no right to be here." The two men sputtered protests but ultimately slinked away, their clipboards tucked under their arms like defeated flags. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them turned to me. "You might want to keep a close eye on these folks. HOA disputes can get messy." "Oh, I will," I replied, already plotting my next move. Doug and his crew thought they could bully me into submission, but they just made a serious mistake. They tried to claim my lake, and now they were going to pay for it. The HOA didn't take their warning from the cops lightly or gracefully. The very next day, Doug Simmons, HOA president extraordinaire, showed up at my property unannounced. I spotted him from my porch, pacing near the edge of my land with a clipboard in hand. He wasn't alone. A couple of his loyal board members were with him, all dressed in their signature khakis and polos. I strolled down to meet them, arms crossed. "Doug, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You've put us in a difficult position," he said, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you trespassing on my property yesterday," I replied. Doug bristled but kept his composure. "The HOA is within its rights to oversee the lake. It's a shared resource for the community, and we have a responsibility to ensure it's properly managed. No, Doug, I said, pulling out my phone. You don't. And if you think your little clipboard army can override private property laws, I'd love to hear how. Doug's smug demeanor faltered for a moment before he doubled down. We've already consulted our legal team. They believe the lake falls under the purview of HOA oversight due to its proximity to member properties. Proximity isn't ownership, I shot back. And unless you've suddenly acquired a deed, your argument is about as solid as quicksand. His lackeys shifted uncomfortably, clearly regretting their decision to back Doug's power play. This isn't over, Doug said, narrowing his eyes. Oh, I'm counting on it, I replied with a smirk. That night, I received an email from the HOA's legal team. It was a hilariously amateur attempt to assert control over the lake, filled with vague language about community agreements and implied access rights. I forwarded it to my lawyer Tim, who practically cackled when he read it. They're grasping at straws, Tim said over the phone. If they had a legitimate claim, they'd be citing specific statutes or property law, not vague nonsense about implied rights. So what's the next move? I asked. Let them dig their own grave, Tim replied. Keep documenting everything. If they escalate, we'll be ready. Sure enough, the HOA escalated. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. Peering out my window, I saw a group of workers unloading a fence along the edge of my property, right by the lake. I stormed outside. What the hell is this? I demanded. One of the workers, clearly uncomfortable, gestured toward Doug, who was overseeing the operation like a wannabe general. It's a community project, Doug said, flashing a fake smile. We're installing a barrier to protect the lake from unauthorized use. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that made him flinch. Unauthorized? Doug, you're the only ones trespassing here. Doug's smile faltered. This is within our rights. No, it isn't, I said, snapping pictures of the workers and the machinery. You're on private property. I'll give you one chance to pack up and leave before I call the cops, again. Doug's face turned beet red, but he signaled for the workers to stop. This isn't the end of it, he said, jabbing a finger in my direction. Oh, I know, I replied. And next time you won't get off with just a warning. As they packed up and left, I reviewed the photos on my phone, a plan already forming in my mind. Doug and his HOA minions thought they could intimidate me with their theatrics, but they had no idea what they were up against. They'd overplayed their hand and now it was my turn. You said. The HOA's stunt with the fence was the final push I needed. Doug and his minions had made it clear they wouldn't back down, but I wasn't going to let them bully me on my own land. It was time to turn the tables. My first move was to go on the offensive, legally, of course. I filed a trespassing complaint with the local authorities, complete with the photos and videos I'd taken of the workers and Doug overseeing the fence installation. Tim, my lawyer, ensured the paperwork was airtight. The complaint caught the HOA off guard. Doug had been so sure of his self-proclaimed authority that he hadn't considered the actual legal consequences of his actions. The HOA's board received a formal notice of the complaint, and their response was almost immediate. A cease and desist letter, accusing me of harassment. I laughed when I read it. If anyone was guilty of harassment, it was the HOA. But I wasn't done yet. While the legal wheels turned, I decided to teach Doug a lesson he wouldn't forget. The next weekend, I rented a boat and spent the day on the lake, fishing, swimming, and generally making a point of enjoying my property. To ensure I had an audience, I invited a few friends and neighbors who'd grown tired of the HOA's antics. Word must have reached Doug because mid-afternoon he showed up with 2 board members in tow, all of them looking like storm clouds. They stood on the shore, glaring at us before finally stomping away when they realized I wasn't about to stop. What they didn't know was that I'd also filed a request for a surveyor to confirm the exact boundaries of my property. When the survey results came back, they reinforced what I already knew. The lake, its shoreline, and even part of the land Doug had tried to fence were entirely mine. Armed with the survey, I took things a step further. I erected a small but noticeable fence around my property's perimeter, complete with signs that read, "Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." The signs were impossible to miss and they sent a clear message. 2 days later, the real fireworks began. Doug, ever the drama king, called the cops on me, claiming my fence was obstructing community access to the lake. I was at home when the officers arrived, and I greeted them with a smile, survey documents in hand. Doug stood off to the side, watching with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face. That smugness evaporated quickly when the officers reviewed the documents and confirmed that the fence was well within my rights as the property owner. "Mr. Simmons," one officer said, turning to Doug. "We've already explained this. This lake and the surrounding property belong to Mr. my last name. You and the HOA have no jurisdiction here." Doug sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of red. "But the community has always used the lake. It's part of our neighborhood." "Usage doesn't equal ownership," the officer replied firmly. "If you or your board members continue to trespass or harass the property owner, there will be legal consequences." The officer then turned to me, handing back my documents. "You're within your rights. Let us know if there are any further issues." Doug's jaw dropped, and for a moment he looked like he might argue. But one stern glance from the officer was enough to send him stomping back to his car. As the officers drove away, I couldn't help but chuckle. Doug had thought he could weaponize the police against me, but his plan had backfired spectacularly. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Doug was too stubborn to let this go, and I was more than ready for whatever he tried next. Doug Simmons was relentless, but so was I. After his humiliating failure with the police, he doubled down on his efforts, flooding my inbox with more HOA notices, fines, and even a demand for arbitration. It was almost laughable, almost. Tim, my lawyer, reassured me that the HOA's attempts were futile, but their constant badgering was wearing thin. If Doug wanted a fight, I was going to end it once and for all. The first step was to expose Doug and the HOA's antics to the broader community. I sent a detailed letter to every property owner in the neighborhood, explaining the situation. The letter included a timeline of events, copies of the survey results, and a summary of the trespassing complaint. The response was overwhelming. Many neighbors expressed their frustration with the HOA's overreach, while others shared their own stories of being bullied by Doug and his board. It turned out I wasn't the only one they had targeted. To capitalize on the momentum, I hosted a community meeting at my property, inviting everyone who wanted to hear the full story. Dozens of people showed up, curious to see the lake and learn more about the battle brewing between me and the HOA. I stood on my dock, addressing the crowd with a calm but firm tone. "This lake is private property. It's mine, and the HOA has no legal claim to it. Doug Simmons and his board have crossed the line time and time again, and I've had enough." The crowd erupted into applause, and I knew I had their support. The next day I took things up a notch. Using the access fees I'd started collecting from non-HOA members who wanted to use the lake, I hired a legal firm specializing in HOA disputes. They filed a cease and desist order against the board, demanding an end to their harassment and illegal attempts to claim my property. The legal firm also helped me draft a countersuit, citing harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. It wasn't about the money. I wanted to send a clear message that their behavior wouldn't be tolerated. When Doug received the court summons, his bravado crumbled. He called an emergency HOA meeting, which I was more than happy to attend. Doug tried to keep the meeting under control, but the other board members were clearly rattled. Several of them voiced their concerns about the legal implications, and a few even suggested that Doug step down. By the end of the meeting, Doug looked like a man defeated. The real victory came a month later, when the HOA officially rescinded all fines and notices related to the lake. Doug was forced to resign as president, and the board issued a public apology for their actions. To celebrate, I invited the entire neighborhood to a lakeside barbecue. People fished, swam, and enjoyed the water without any interference from clipboard-wielding busybodies. As the sun set over the lake, one of my neighbors raised a toast to standing up for what's right, and to keeping Doug far away from the water. We all laughed, clinking glasses as the sky turned shades of gold and pink. Standing on the dock, watching the ripples on the water, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I'd fought for my rights and won, turning the lake into a symbol of freedom from HOA tyranny. And Doug? Well, the last I heard, he'd moved to another neighborhood. I could only hope he'd learned his lesson.